Good morning, Mr. Michael E. O'Hanlon. Thank you very much for joining us here over here in Pakistan. And we were really looking forward to hear from you. But before I begin and ask you to talk about Brookings, I will play the message by our president, IRS. He really wanted to join us, but he had an appointment, so he had to go. So we'll play his message. So, Hasib, can you play the message, please?
Good evening and good morning to everyone. It's a matter of great honor for me to welcome today Michael E. O'Hanlon, Senior Research Fellow and Director of Research at the Brookings Institute. He will be speaking to us about the world of research and about his prestigious institution. Research is something which is of immense importance. It not only enables us to get a initial knowledge of the various things which are at hand, but it also equips us with all the necessary tools for analysis and, most importantly, to give out policy recommendations which are essential in contemporary times for framing of policy. I would like to have been present during this entire session, but unfortunately, due to the change of timings, I had a previous speaking engagement and I have to proceed for that. I hope that this session will be extremely productive and it will be beneficial for all. Let me again thank everyone for being here, and especially our honorable speaker for sparing time to speak to us today. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mariam.
Let me just first introduce you briefly, very briefly, because you had a huge introduction. Um, so let me just begin and quickly introduce you. Mr. Michael E. O'Hanlon is a senior fellow and director of research and foreign policy at the Brookings Institutions, where he specializes in U.S. defense strategy, the use of military force, and American national security policy. He directs the Straub Talbot Center on Security, Strategy, and Technology, as well as the Defense Industrial Base Working Group, and is the inaugural holder of the Philip H. Knight Chair in Defense and Strategy. He co-directs the African Security Initiative as well. He's an adjunct professor at Columbia, Georgetown, and George Washington universities. He has also written various books, and the latest is The Art of War in the Age of Peace, U.S. Grand Strategy and Resolute Restraint. I think we need another webinar on this book because it looks really interesting. So over to you with this brief introduction. Over to you, Mr. O'Hanlon.
Thank you kindly, Miriam, and greetings, friends from halfway around the world. It's nice to be with you on this December 19th, a very cold morning in Washington as winter prepares to arrive. But it's great to be connecting and exchanging thoughts. So let me just say a few brief things about Brookings to start, also with apologies that I'm wearing sunglasses because it helps my eyes survive the computer screen better. Brookings is, I think, the oldest think tank in the United States, perhaps the world. It's about 106 years old. Started in 1916, right during World War I. And a banker from St. Louis, Missouri, which is in the middle of our country, named Robert Brookings, chose to create a small research institute near the White House that could perhaps help the government get better at managing its books, its numbers, its money, and its policy ideas. 1916 was an interesting moment because, of course, we were gearing up at this point to, as it turns out, enter World War I. We had not yet entered World War I, and we hadn't really quite made the decision to do so. In fact, President Woodrow Wilson was campaigning for re-election on a platform of promising not to fight in Europe, but we were very heavily involved in shipping supplies to Britain and France, even though we weren't completely on their side in that war. It was a little bit more complicated. For one thing, as you'll appreciate, Woodrow Wilson opposed British imperialism and colonialism, and he didn't really just want to take the British and French side. But anyway, that's sort of the context for how we started. We were small, we were near the White House, right in Washington. And Later on, we grew, we helped develop the idea behind the Marshall Plan after World War II, and then really grew into the larger organization that we are today, about a mile north of the White House, based on one of Washington, D.C.'s major transportation arteries called Massachusetts Avenue. And we have a total of 4 buildings that we either own or largely occupy. And we have 5 different research programs. My own program is foreign policy studies. About 15 years ago, part of foreign policy studies broke off and created a program called Global Economy and Development, focused more on the human development and economic dimensions of trying to help policymakers in the broader developing world, so to speak. So our interest in South Asia is actually divided into both the foreign policy program, which tends to focus more on security and politics, and the global economy and development program, which again focuses primarily on quality of life, human development, health, education, etc. So those are 2 of the 5. Then we also have economic studies, and economic studies has economists who work on primarily American issues of economics, but also international issues. But more of the developmental economists would have already been in that global economy and development program that I mentioned a minute ago. Our most famous economist is Ben Bernanke, who just won the Nobel Prize in economics for work that he had done when he was my young professor at Princeton back in the 1980s. And of course, he was also the chairman of the Federal Reserve during the global financial crisis of 2008 and beyond, where he was instrumental in trying to prevent a second Great Depression. And I think, generally speaking, successful, even though the overall crisis was a terrible thing and hurt a lot of people around the world and remains a major mistake that began in the United States and then spread. But Ben Bernanke was the guy charged with trying to prevent it from getting worse. So that's economic studies. Then we have a 4th research program that's called governance studies, and that's also largely focused on American politics. So congressional deliberations, making of the budget, the way in which Congress makes its rules, sets up its leadership, creates its work agenda, interacts between the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then also with the executive branch, all that kind of stuff. But governance studies also looks at issues of technology like cyber, and looks at issues concerning privacy and surveillance, and runs the blog Lawfare, which sort of overlaps with our foreign policy portfolio as well. So sometimes the divisions between these different programs are not completely clean, and that's probably good, because to be honest, one of my small critiques of Brookings, and by the way, I've been there 28 years continuously, so obviously I like it, and this is a small critique, but it's significant. We don't always work that well across different programmatic boundaries. So we don't collaborate that well between different programs. We collaborate well within programs. And sometimes we do group projects with colleagues inside our program. We're not as good at working across the whole institution. So that's just a challenge. It'll be a challenge for our new president. We're presently looking for a new president. We have an interim president, and her name is Amy Liu, of Chinese origin, but raised in the United States. And she's been at Brookings herself for about 25 years. And before she became the interim president, she ran our 5th and final research program, Metropolitan Studies, which was created about 25 years ago. So it was the 4th program created. We'd already had foreign policy, economic studies, and governance. And then 25 years ago, we created Metropolitan Studies. And then, as I mentioned, about 15 years ago, global economy and development. But the Metropolitan Studies program is largely focused on helping cities figure out what works best for their economic development, for their problems of taking care of their populations. And it's a little different than the rest of the research programs. It's more about networking around the United States and even beyond, even overseas sometimes. So it also overlaps with our foreign policy program as well as global economy and development. But it has primarily a focus on exchanging best practices and creating networks among many mayors and city councils and urban development planners and officials, and trying to figure out how do you redevelop a part of a city that's, fallen into disrepair or neglect. How do you economically develop a suburb in a way that makes sense and doesn't just create huge urban sprawl? To some extent, metropolitan studies may look at issues like crime and safety, but that has not been its main focus historically. It's focused more on economic development within cities and metropolitan areas. So one last time, foreign policy studies, economic studies, governance studies, global economy and development, metropolitan studies. Those are our 5. And then we have a superstructure of communications and development to help us raise money, and the president and vice president of the institution, or the executive vice president, and our general counsel, because we also have to worry about a lot of legal issues in terms of, perceived conflict of interest. We have to make sure we're not seen as trying to represent the views of a foreign government. In fact, we have this law in the United States called the Foreign Agents Registration Act. It goes back to the 1930s when people were worried that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime in Germany were trying to influence American policymakers. So they wrote a law saying that if you want to, as an American, if you want to ever act as a mouthpiece for a foreign government, you must register with the US government first. And Brookings has a policy that you can't do it at all. Doesn't matter if you're registered or not, that's not our job. And unfortunately, our previous boss, a good friend of mine named John Allen, General John Allen, who was the commander of the International Security Advisory Force in Afghanistan back in 2012, 2013, he ultimately fell victim to this law in the sense that he was trying to help solve a problem in 2017 between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And the latter 2 countries, and I think also Bahrain, were blockading Qatar over a sort of, frankly, a silly dispute. And John Allen was trying to get them to work together and lighten, their disagreement, try to move beyond. And ultimately, he was perceived by some people as representing the interests and even acting as an advocate for the government of Qatar, which I do not think was a correct interpretation of what happened. But because of the perception, he was asked to resign as president of Brookings. So we have to spend a lot of time. That's why we have a general counsel office that's grown over the years. And so we have a lot of different aspects to our central organization that tie the 5 different research programs together. The overall size of Brookings, our budget is close to $100 million a year. The foreign policy program is a little bit under $20 million a year. And we raise that money largely through private philanthropy, foundations that provide money for research, sometimes government grants, but we don't take any money from non-democratic governments. So we decided not to take any money from countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, or China. We used to have offices in Beijing, New Delhi, and Doha, Qatar, but we decided it was better over time to let those offices become their own independent think tanks, raise their own separate funds, handle their own issues of conflict of interest and legal matters individually, and then we would maintain affiliation with them more indirectly and collaborate sometimes, but as distinct entities. So we don't have any overseas offices anymore, and we don't really have any domestic offices outside of Washington, D.C. We've sometimes had a very small presence in Nevada for crazy reasons I won't explain to you. That's a tiny office, and I'm not even sure of its current state. So almost all of our people live and work in Washington. And even after this COVID period, when we've redefined work, basically everybody is living inside of the Washington, D.C. area with only a very few exceptions. We do have affiliates who are non-resident senior fellows, usually unpaid, who may live in other parts of the country or even other parts of the world, but the entire paid staff, almost the entire paid staff, is within the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, including my state of Maryland, the state of Virginia, District of Columbia itself, and some people as far away as Delaware or West Virginia. And very last thing, and then I'll start to, and we have about several hundred employees roughly. Again, it depends whether you count non-residents, et cetera, but I believe we have something in the range of 400 to 500 full-time paid staff. So that's a pretty big number, but we're still much smaller than universities, large universities anyway, in terms of faculty, staff, kind of numbers, or, sort of pecking order, organization, paid personnel, under that general framework. So we have senior fellows, research assistants, people who work on development communications, even within each of the research programs. And none of us have tenure. We don't have academic tenure because we don't have a financial model that would allow that. But we do have a presumption that if you are a scholar who's published a couple of books or the equivalent and become a senior fellow, like I did 20 years ago, that the institution will work very hard to protect your academic freedom. And as long as you're working hard to try to help raise money and produce good research, we will do our utmost to keep you on the payroll, even though we can't make any promises. So that's a distinction from the academic world with tenure, but it's sort of like a soft tenure. It's sort of like we will make sort of a pledge, not written down anywhere, but understood, that if you're established as a scholar and you're productive and you're a good colleague, that Brookings will try to keep finding ways to raise money to keep you on the payroll. And then the very last thing should be, I get maybe the most important, and probably where most of your questions and comments will go as soon as I finish up here, which is like, what do we actually do? What do we produce? And how do we interact with the rest of Washington, and specifically the government, as we try to influence policy and provide new original ideas to help the public policy agenda? That's our job. Our job is to help solve major problems in the public policy arena. So, the informal name is we're a think tank. I think you may use that kind of terminology in Pakistan as well, but a more formal name would be a public policy research organization. And then another sort of nickname could be like a university without students. We don't have students. A lot of us teach on the side. I teach at Columbia University and Georgetown University, and a number of other colleagues do the same thing, but we don't have any students of our own or any graduate program of our own. The Foreign Policy Studies program and the Governance Studies program, we generally begin our research with book writing. So the foundation for our expertise and for our other work is usually to be working on a given book project. And Miriam, you were nice enough to mention my most recent book. I've also got a book coming out next month that I worked on through most of the COVID shutdown, called Military History for the Modern Strategist: America's Major Wars Since 1861, since our Civil War. And that's the kind of work we do within our own research programs, but that really just establishes the foundation, because for most of us, we only sell at most a few thousand books, a few thousand copies of any given book. And therefore, our influence is often through meetings with government officials. It's often through writing shorter articles in newspapers or academic journals or more popular journals like Foreign Affairs. It is sometimes going on television and radio. So we try to get the message out in many different ways. We don't have any institutional points of view or any institutional positions on issues. Those are the rights and prerogatives of the individual scholars, which means we often have scholars disagreeing with each other. It's usually a fairly amicable disagreement, fairly professional, based on research, and actually somewhat encouraged within Brookings, because we like to remind policymakers and others that we do not have a political party affiliation. We probably have more Democrats individually than Republicans, but we have plenty of both. And no scholar's research should be dictated or predetermined by the views or ideologies of a political party. Our linkages to political parties tend to be fairly limited and on a person-by-person basis. So over the years, we've often had scholars go into government, but I have not done that. I started on the congressional side in the early 1990s and then wound up at Brookings in 1994, and I stayed ever since. I do help with, sometimes we're on advisory boards. I'm part of something called the Defense Policy Board, and I spent 2 days last week at the Pentagon working with a security clearance with full briefings from Pentagon officials to try to be an advisory, informal, unpaid board of some kind for the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary and the Undersecretary for Policy. So we often have those kind of interactions, even when we're staying independent and doing our own work separately. And we're encouraged, again, as long as our research drives our results and drives our positions, we're encouraged to be completely independent and to say what we think, and often to challenge the existing orthodoxy of whatever political party may be in town and may be in the White House and the Congress. So I think I'll stop there, Miriam, if that's okay. There's a lot more to talk about, but I'll look forward to your reactions, comments, and questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Michael Hanlon, for a very broad view of Brookings. There are so many questions that are coming to my mind. When I was looking at the history of Brookings, I was amazed to see that it was established in, I think, 1916.
Right.
And since then, there were 8 or 9 presidents that were that actually led Brookings. So why is it so less? So less people led Brookings. What is the process of selecting a president? And secondly, what is the tenure and why the presidents have been so consistent? And what is the reason for stability? Because we really are looking for stability in Pakistan also, as
Well,
far as the leadership is concerned.
Right. That's interesting. Well, that's a nice observation. I think you're right that it is fairly striking how few presidents we've had and how long they typically serve. So obviously an average of more than 10 years per president. But if you think about how academic institutions evolve, if you want to create a strong tradition of loyalty and sometimes be able to convince a professor at Stanford or Georgetown or Harvard or someplace to leave their university, leave their tenured job and come to Brookings, or even a young professor who does not have tenure but is on a fast track to academic success, we're sort of competing with the university system. And the university system does grant tenure, of course. And therefore, we need to make the environment at Brookings stable enough and appealing enough that people don't have the impression they're going to come just for 2 or 3 years and then be asked to leave. And some think tanks do operate more like that. People are at the think tank in stages for 2 or 3 or 4 years, wait for their political party to come back into power, and then go join the next administration. But we don't do a lot of that at Brookings. We do some, but not a lot, which means the president of the institution has to build a foundation of stability and also of academic excellence and rigor. And any imprint the president wants to have on the research agenda or on the way we do business typically will take, therefore, several years to begin to develop, because they can't just come in and fire half the staff. That would destroy the culture and the concept that I just tried to explain that is crucial to attracting the best researchers. So if presidents want to make a difference, it usually takes them 3 or 4 or 5 years even to get started in really having new initiatives, raising money to be able to hire new people, trying to steer scholars to do somewhat different things with their research or with their output. And And so presidents tend to want to stay 10 years or more because it really takes that long to have a notable, lasting, high-level impact on the way the institution does its job. So that's part of the reason. Another reason, we've often had people who have been hired in their 50s, let's say, and already had a distinguished career, perhaps in government, and really saw this not so much as their swan song, but as their last big job. So none of them, I've worked now under 4 presidents at Brookings, plus the interim president, Amy Liu, the 5th. None of them went from Brookings to another job in government. The first one, he had been in the Federal Reserve. He was an economist, Bruce McLaury, and he was only president for a couple of years at the beginning of my stay. And then he retired, and he still is doing pretty well. He's got to be well into his 80s, but I see him every so often. And yeah, but he had no interest in doing anything subsequently. Then after that, Mike Armacost ran Brookings for just 5 years. And it's interesting, Mike Armacost, he's still a friend of mine. He now is out at Stanford University. He's also in his 80s, but he had been a Foreign Service officer, and he had been ambassador of the United States to Japan and the Philippines. And then in his late 50s or 60-year range, he retired from the Foreign Service and thought he would do Brookings for a few years because it seemed like an interesting job. And then he left Brookings and retired to Stanford University, has a certain affiliation out there, but mostly is just enjoying his retirement life. And the interesting thing, having done it for just 5 years, he's not really that well remembered by the Brookings population. Of course, most people have have arrived at Brookings after his departure, because he left Brookings 20 years ago. So I'm one of the very few people who's been at Brookings long enough to remember Mike Armacost. But 5 years turns out not to have been quite enough time to really make a big, lasting impression. Now, he did do a couple things that were significant that people often forget. The creation of the Metropolitan Studies program was under his guidance, for example. And he's the one, who, as president, who really started to promote greater writing for newspapers and greater engagement with media. People sometimes forget that he was really the first Brookings president to promote those things. But, 5 years turns out to be not quite enough. And after him was Strobe Talbot, who I think is pretty famous even today in South Asia, because he worked a lot on the U.S.-India relationship and, to some extent, the U.S.-Pakistan relationship in the late 1990s when he was Deputy Secretary of State for Bill Clinton, President Clinton. But he stayed about almost 15 years as president of Brookings, and he built the place up. He really brought us into the digital age. He created these overseas centers that we've subsequently, sort of cut free and asked to be independent, but he was the one who had the idea to do that. He grew the size of Brookings by, I think he doubled the size, roughly speaking, over his tenure, created the Global Economy and Development Program on his watch, created the television studio. All sorts of things happened under Strobe Talbot. Actually, the television studio might have started under Armacost, but it really flourished under Talbot. In any event, that was a sort of more typical run because it really gave time for many of these new ideas to germinate, to take root, to grow, to expand. And then Strobe had no interest in going back to government. If he was at such a high level that if the only thing he really could have done, possibly if Hillary Clinton had won the presidency in 2008 or in 2016, she might have asked him to be Secretary of State, but more likely she would have asked Richard Holbrooke to be Secretary of State, and Strobe would have stayed right where he was, because there just aren't that many jobs left once you've already been Deputy Secretary of State. So your chances of, my whole point is, most presidents don't really have an ambition or much of a realistic path to go back into government or to any other academic job. So they tend to stay at Brookings long enough to really try to make an impact, a lasting impression, and then they retire. And finally, John Allen, who I already mentioned, did the job for 5 years. And he had a couple of notable initiatives like emphasizing artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies, building a small team that would research these aspects of public policy. Also, he engaged with the whole issue of should we take money from the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis. He decided no, we should not. So he made all those changes. He made the overseas research centers independent, and he focused on the middle class in America and created a middle class initiative for Brookings Research. So those were sort of his lasting legacies. But 5 years was pretty quick. He didn't intend to leave after 5. Like I mentioned, he sort of had to for unfortunate reasons that were a little bit unfair to him and probably not that good for the institution. But in any event, that's a long way of answering your question, Miriam. But, Brookings has become almost like the think tank equivalent of an Ivy League university, partly because of the stability, the standards of excellence. And so it's not really seen as just a holding pen for people waiting to go back into government, which is the way certain other think tanks are often seen. We are more like, we like to think of ourselves more like an Ivy League research institution. And that requires a commitment to stability, to institution building, to continuity.
Thank you very much for your answer. The questions are pouring in, though there are so many questions in my mind also, but I'll give chance to others. There is a question by Samir. He wants to know what is the average number of research article a researcher has to produce? He mainly wants to ask about the quantity, how much quantity matters in Brookings.
Yeah, it's a good question. We often say that we would like to have a scholar in the foreign policy program always have a book project, and that can take anywhere from, let's say, 1.5 years to 4 years, or even 5 years. But also, at the same time, to be producing, let's say, 1 to 2 articles per month, per year, 1 to 2 research articles or chapters in books. We don't really like edited books that well, but we do like to see people write in major journals and to produce papers that don't require a long delay in publication. And we do publish our own papers as well on the Brookings website. So 1 to 2 of those kind of, mid-length essays per year would be normally considered the preferred output. Now, there's no hard and fast rule. And I think in 2022, I wrote 4 articles of that sort of length, anywhere from 3,000 words up to, in one case, 17,000. So I did one really long paper trying to understand if China blockaded Taiwan, how would that play out? And looking at the military dimensions of a Chinese blockade of Taiwan with then an American Taiwan reaction and intervention to try to break the blockade and resume shipping in and out of Taiwan. So that became a very long article. But I also wrote articles assessing Biden's overall foreign policy, President Biden. I wrote an article about how to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine by strengthening NATO's eastern flank. And I wrote an article coming off one of my book projects about what I sort of call the new national security agenda to complement and sort of add on to the traditional threats that we had already been thinking about prior. So for me, I wrote 4, but that was probably more than I usually would. Normally, I'm more like maybe 2 to 3. And one thing our current Vice President for Foreign Policy Studies is trying to emphasize, her name is Suzanne Maloney. She's an Iran expert and a very good leader. And we're lucky to have her running our program. And she has said she would like scholars to do a little bit less blogging and a little bit more of the kind of articles that we're talking about right now. Because from her perspective, Brookings' distinguishing feature is its commitment to rigor and academic style research on public policy issues. We don't really like to use academic style writing or, semantics. Most of us might have had political science degrees or policy degrees from, and almost all of us have PhDs if we're scholars, but most of us have a slightly different perspective than a classic American political scientist. A lot of us are regionalists focusing on, East Asia, South Asia, Middle East, what have you, Europe. And so in that sense, we are probably not going to write as often for, Political Science Quarterly as we might write for the Washington Quarterly, or for our own Brookings website. So the way we define articles, we don't have a classic university style list of which journals are the most important based on their reputation within academic circles. There really is a bit of a distance. Even though most of us come from political science or policy traditions, there's really a bit of a gulf between people who work in think tank land and people who work in American universities, even if we're sort of all interested in the same general set of problems. So in that sense, 1 to 2 articles a year, but it doesn't have to be like a double-blind peer-reviewed journal. It's often better for us to get our work out more quickly and in a more accessible kind of writing style, still well footnoted, still well researched, but a little bit more conversational or a little bit more accessible, a little more for a general audience, etc. So that's the best I can do to answer that question.
Thank you very much. I would also like to know about the editorial staff of the Brookings, how editing is done. But before that, there is another question by Ms. Somera Iqbal. She wants to know that how much impactful the research study findings are in real policy making.
Yeah, so, well, first let me do the editorial. So we have a communications team within each research program, as well as the communications team for the whole institution. The one for the whole institution builds our website, makes sure we can do events that are webcast, runs the TV studio, creates the Brookings-wide email bursts that can go out to our interested readership once a week or whatever. The teams within the research programs, they do the editing and the quality control and the immediate posting of written work that you're asking about, Miriam. And also those of us who run centers, like I run what's called the Strobe Talbot Center on Security Strategy and Technology. And that's one center within the foreign policy program. And so I've got about 6 scholars plus a few visiting fellows who work with us each year. And so I have to supervise the review of articles written by my scholars. And so we always try to get scholar input. And if there are big problems with somebody's argument, then we do ask them to go back and fix those problems, and let us see the revised article, sort of like a, revise and resubmit process with an academic journal. If there are only small issues, then we simply provide feedback, let them make whatever changes they want, and then send the article to our communications team, which is about 3 or 4 people within foreign policy studies. And then they would edit and format and post the article. And they might hire an outside firm to help if they need the help, if they're sort of underwater with too much work. So that's the editorial and production process. On the issue of how do we know if we're having impact, let me start by with a slogan or an adage that I learned when I first came to Washington 30 some years ago, which was, you can get a lot done in Washington if you don't insist on taking credit for it. So we have a dilemma, to answer your question and to do our job. The dilemma is that if we want to be out there trumpeting our own brilliance, that we came up with this idea and look, it became public policy and we directly influenced, some law or some shift in US military operations or basing structure overseas. If you insist on taking that kind of credit, you make yourself less popular. People don't enjoy working with you as much because public officials want to also take some of the credit themselves. So if you're trying to convince them to do something, they might have, curiosity about your idea because they respect our work, or they want to make a mark and they are looking for creative, original ideas. But the minute you tell the world that it was really Brookings' idea and not Senator so-and-so or Secretary so-and-so, then the relationship changes and becomes less productive and collegial. So, we often do better if we're a little bit more indirect and a little quieter. I'll give two examples from my own work. So I wrote a book in 2019 called The Senkaku Paradox, Risking Great Power War Over Small Stakes, about the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, which both China and Japan claim. Nobody lives there. They're uninhabited. They're basically uninhabitable. They're small, but it's a matter of pride. And to some extent, the economic zones around those islands that Japan and China both want. And so in the course of writing this book, I developed a concept that I call integrated deterrence. And the idea was that if China ever grabs one of these Senkaku Islands with military force, and let's say puts 100 soldiers ashore, I don't think the United States and Japan want to be in the position of having to either go kill those soldiers or just leave the aggression unchecked. We need to have some way to punish the Chinese aggression, but ideally avoid drawing first blood in a superpower confrontation between two nuclear-armed countries. The Senkaku Islands are not really worth the risk of nuclear war. And so I developed this concept of integrated deterrence that involves economic aspects of, national security policy making, punishing China economically, thinking about how do you punish at the right level, and how do you make sure that we could withstand any Chinese response? In other words, we depend on China for a lot of economic activity, as does Pakistan, as do many countries in the world. And if we're going to get into an economic war with China, we need to know what we're doing and prepare for it by having more resilience, diversity and redundancy and supply for key commodities, et cetera, so that if we apply sanctions against China and then China retaliates by applying sanctions or some kind of an embargo against us, that we could still withstand that. So I developed this concept, published in 2019. Starting in 2021, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin starts to use that same phrase in his speeches and now in his national defense strategy that came out earlier this year. And I know Secretary Austin quite well because I'm on the Defense Policy Board, but I actually knew him when he was commander in Iraq 15 years ago, or almost 15 years ago. And so he and I have talked about this concept. And he gives me credit for coming up with it, but he doesn't say that I was the source of his own idea. He says we're sort of like two minds thinking similarly. So I'm sort of, in a way, complementing and reinforcing his idea, which he says was independent. And I believe him. It's not like he's trying to steal my work. In fact, he acknowledges that I've been doing this kind of writing myself even longer than he's been using the phrase. But I don't go out and say that I made up the term because that would be a little presumptuous and make me look like I'm trying to steal the credit. And I just don't, I would rather have my influence be a little bit more subtle. I can remind people, just like I'm telling all of you today, that I actually published this concept in 2019, and the Pentagon did not start using it until 2021. But I don't say I was the author of the concept categorically. And that's just a small example that tries to speak to your question, because we have no guaranteed access to policymakers. Nobody has to call us up and say, what's your best idea on this or that? It's a much more flexible, fluid kind of environment where it depends on relationships, it depends on research interests. And just one last small story. This past weekend, I went to a Christmas party on Saturday, 2 days ago, and I wound up arriving at the Christmas party at the same time as Secretary of State Tony Blinken and his wife. And I've known them for 25 years. We're not close friends, but we're friendly. And so I wind up talking to him for 20 minutes at this party. And it was great, but I didn't try to grab him to say, here's my idea on what to do next about issue X, Y, or Z, because it was a Christmas party. And, he was there to relax. And if he wants to call me up some other time, we have the relationship. And it's a friendly relationship, but he also knows that I'm always going to speak my own mind. And the fact that I will give him private, friendly advice doesn't mean that I will always support him with my public writing. So That's the sort of interaction that is fairly common in Washington, but it's not based on any formal relationship or any formal role that Brookings has in the process. And sometimes you feel like you're putting your ideas out there and no one's listening. Or maybe just your students are listening if you're a professor someplace because they have to, because you put your article on the reading list. But otherwise, it sometimes feels a little bit lonely. Like you have to keep at it. And over a period of time, maybe you get heard, but you have to wait for your moment. And you can't really predict when that moment will arise. So I would just, to any young scholar in the United States or Pakistan or anywhere else, I would just say, build up your own, build up your own writing portfolio, build up your own reputation as a serious scholar, but also a colleague that people like to work with, who's honest and who's collaborative, and you will succeed. You will be heard, but you won't know when, and you won't know by whom. That part is beyond your control, and that's okay.
Thank you very much. I really liked the last part of building up your own honesty. Honesty is very important for a scholar, and I think for anyone who wants to do something.
Right.
One last question. I would really like to know that are the individuals, it is because of the individuals that Brookings has become Brookings, because people like you have been associated with it, people like Stephen P. Cohen, who has worked a lot, who has written a lot of books about India and Pakistan, and he's not here with us in this world anymore. He has passed away, but his work it still lives.
Right.
Is it because of the individuals, or is it the system of the Brookings which nourishes an individual and make people like you and Stephen P. Cohen?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll answer it in just 1 second. But I saw the follow-up in the chat about the output frequency for articles, and I would say, yeah, once every 3 months is quite a bit. And sometimes I maintain that pace myself, but I would rather not be forced to maintain that pace, because then it feels like I just have to write something for the sake of visibility. And especially at this point in my career, I'm 61 years old. I've been at Brookings 28 years. I would rather just write something once a year that really gets noticed, rather than something 4 times a year that I could add to my CV. And in my CV, I do not include all my articles from my lifetime. I know certain academics, they have like a 10-page appendage to their CV. And maybe you feel that pressure in Pakistan, I don't know. But I don't like those kind of CVs, because it sort of conflates the important articles with the ones that people maybe were doing early in their career just to have a certain track record of output. And just one example on that front, I had a colleague at Brookings a few years ago named Jung Pak, Jungpak. She's Korean American. She's now in the government working for the State Department. But she was an expert on Kim Jong-un of North Korea. And she worked on Kim Jong-un for 7 years before joining Brookings, when she was at the Central Intelligence Agency. And she wrote this article, I think maybe in early 2018, called The Education of Kim Jong-un. And it was a way to try to understand why he was detonating nuclear weapons and launching ICBMs and having a confrontational posture towards the United States. And it was a fantastic article. It was a little bit long, but it was very well written, very well researched, and it was one of the most widely read articles in Brookings history on the internet. Now, it was much better for Jung Pak to do that than to have written 4 smaller articles that might have been published in journal X, Y, or Z, and each of which might have gotten only a little bit of notoriety, and none of which would have been stitched together with the broader argument that she was able to make by concentrating on just one really good article. And then she turned that idea into a book, which a couple of years later was published under the title of Becoming Kim Jong-un. And so that, I just wanted to add that commentary. Sorry that I took so long to make that answer that I've now partly forgotten. Miriam, just quickly remind me of your question, your last question.
Individuals or the system?
Thank you.
Which is important?
Thank you, Steve. First of all, let me join you in saluting Steve Cohen. He was a good friend of mine, and I went to his memorial service, which I think was about 6 years ago at this point, 5 years ago, something like that, before COVID, but maybe somewhere in the mid 2010s. So I was colleagues with Steve Cohen for about 15 years. And we had convinced him to leave his previous job where, as you know, he developed a very good South Asia Studies program at the University of Illinois. But he did that over about a 35-year career. I think he served in the Reagan administration for 2 years, but otherwise he was an academic his whole life until he came to Washington and to Brookings somewhere around the age that I am now, 60-ish. And again, worked at Brookings for 15, 16, 17 years until his passing. Or he might have retired about a year before he died, but he was very prolific even up until close to the end. And just saying this sort of emphasizes, Miriam, your point that it really is the individual scholars that ultimately keep the institution going. You know, we can talk about something we were involved in historically, like the Marshall Plan after World War II, but what people care about is what's Brookings doing today, and what kind of team does it have? What kind of research does it do? Who are the creative voices? Who are the interesting people? What's the environment like? And so we certainly benefit from being well-established, well-known, and fairly large, fairly broad in our coverage of public policy issues. But none of that's good enough if we don't have individual scholars, some of whom may be superstars and very well known, like Robert Kagan or Ben Bernanke, and others of whom are just very well known within their specific field. And then some of us who are a little bit in between, who have been involved in prominent public policy debates, because I do defense analysis. And so I did a lot of stuff during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that gave me a lot of personal visibility at that time. I don't think I was ever as prominent or as well known as, let's say, Bob Kagan, but I was known beyond my immediate circle of defense specialists. And so those are kind of the different ways Brookings scholars get to be well regarded or well known. And, you know, usually if you're going to ask somebody out on, you know, in Capitol Hill or somewhere else in the country or in Washington, what do you think of Brookings? They're going to probably answer that question based on the 5 Brookings scholars that they can immediately visualize, as opposed to just the history of the organization. The last point is that there were these think tank rankings done by a project at the University of Pennsylvania by a lovely man who passed away, I think earlier this year, named Jim McGann. He died too young of a heart attack at about age 66. But before that, he created this system that was designed to give more visibility to think tanks and to create some standards for evaluating their contributions, and also for creating think tank networks within the United States, but also internationally. I went to a conference that he had organized once in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, for example. And that was, so he had this vision of creating a somewhat collegial, but somewhat competitive system of networking of think tanks. And some of that was good, but I never really liked the ranking system. Brookings often came in number 1 in the world, but I didn't think that really meant very much, because most of us do our work individually or in small teams. And yes, we are proud of the organization. And yes, we should sometimes collaborate more with each other, like I said a few minutes ago. But the idea of ranking Brookings based on some general perception of our role in the process, to me, that's, you know, I never go around and describe Brookings as the best think tank in the world, because I don't really think that's necessarily accurate. I think we're the best known and we're among the best, but I don't see any point in like sitting on our laurels or just, you know, trumpeting our glory from the ramparts as if, you know, we've won some sports competition like some World Cup or something, because ultimately we're colleagues with people from other think tanks trying to solve common problems that afflict the country and the world. And so I want to see individual work well recognized, to your question, Miriam, but I also want to see us echo and reinforce each other's good work, and not just the work done at Brookings, but elsewhere. So the idea of just building up Brookings' reputation as if we're in some zero-sum competition with other research organizations, I don't really take that approach myself. And ultimately, I do think Brookings is primarily a place where individual excellent scholarship happens. And a lot of it happens. And we learn from each other within Brookings. So we interact collegially to get our ideas. But ultimately, what we put out there is individuals or small teams speaking for themselves with big new ideas. And that's what really carries us, year by year into whatever status and stature we possess.
Thank you very much. Just 2 minutes left, and I have another question with you, and I think it is going to require a big answer because this question is that please educate us about the effective writing style. It is by my colleague, Ms. Nabila Jaffer. And how is the process of writing evaluated?
Well, I'll try to give a simple answer because we're almost out of time, but also, like you said, Miriam, I could make this answer big or specific. I'll make it specific. I try to write like Ernest Hemingway. What I mean by that is I try not to write like a political scientist. I don't like jargon. I don't like the idea that I'm only speaking to my fellow political scientists who do international relations or even security studies. I always want to imagine my audience as a smart congressman who might not even be on the Armed Services Committee or the Foreign Affairs Committee, but still has to vote sometimes on the big issues of the defense budget or whether to use force or how to build our relationship with China or what to do about the crisis in Ukraine, and wants big ideas that are accessible to someone who is smart but not necessarily a specialist. So I always want to write in a way that's clear and that assumes my audience is a really smart generalist who does not know that much about my field of study, but wants to learn and is a quick enough study to be able to pick it up fast. So I need to connect all the dots and make the logical flow very clear. I should not presuppose they know what I'm talking about with use of some arcane term in political science. Keep it simple, and go fast at the same time, because you presume that they are smart, and that as long as you provide the intellectual scaffolding, they can keep up with you. The nice thing about this approach is it also, as a scholar, forces you to be very clear about your own logic. You can't just fall back on some cliche or some adage from the political science world that sometimes we employ without even remembering exactly what it means. Like a lot of people talk about the liberal world order. And I don't like that phrase because I think it means different things to different people. I think you should explain it, not just assume people know what it means. And so I tend not to use it at all. Or I might say the so-called liberal order and then say, which means XYZ. And that's just one example. Or, is there a security dilemma between India and Pakistan? Well, okay, let's explain what that phrase means instead of assuming that all of our readers understand Bob Jervis's books and have all read them and immediately know what it means to say security dilemma. No, I'd rather explain it, which then forces me to be very clear in my own head about what I think it is, rather than sort of being a little bit intellectually lazy or careless myself. So Hemingway wrote books that were, obviously he's a much better writer than I am, but he wrote books where he didn't try to write like James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, long, convoluted sentences with a lot of big words. He wrote accessible, pithy, and he wanted to carry a story with his language. He didn't want to show off his vocabulary. So that's the best I can do. And I think that's my way of thinking about it. But I think most people at Brookings think sort of like that. For example, Bob Kagan, I'll finish on this. Bob Kagan, who's now coming out with a book next month himself. And he's an historian and a strategist and extremely well known and regarded in Washington and beyond. And he writes just the most beautiful, simple prose. And he'll have interesting turns of phrase. Every so often he'll use a fancy word, but for the most part, he's just trying to say really clearly what he thinks. And he wants the idea to be what grabs you, not the words, not the prose. So that's the best I can do with that question as well. It's really been a pleasure being with you all today, and feel free to stay in touch.
Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time and we learned a lot from you. And I think I really want to have some suggestions and some advice from you about writing a book, because you have
Good.
also mentioned that writing books is really important in research. So thank you very much.
So
And
I'll give you two thoughts on that as I sign off. One, when you start a book, you don't need to know everything you're going to say in the book. You don't need to have a 10-page detailed outline, but you do need to know the one central reason you're doing it. What is the main argument you want to develop? What is the main question that you want to explore? And at least you want to at least have some working hypothesis when you start. Obviously, you don't need to know the final argument or thesis, because that's something you're going to develop as you do the research, as you do the writing, as you do the editing. But you need to have some overarching purpose. And usually that requires a really important problem you're trying to address and some kind of an initial working hypothesis on what policy intervention might help to address it, or at least, enough of a sense that you can begin the research. That's point one. Point two, back to Hemingway. Hemingway always said, try to write every day. And now he was writing fiction. Hopefully I'm not writing too much fiction, but what he would say is start writing early in the day when you're fresh, and then stop writing when you still know what you want to say next. Don't wind up the next day with a writer's block. In other words, instead of getting every last thing out there, squeezing the orange or squeezing the lemon to get every little bit of, intellectual curiosity out of your brain to conclude a thought, it's actually okay to stop today's writing when you still have a sense of what you're going to write next. And it may take you a minute tomorrow morning to get in the right mentality. You might have to review what you wrote, refresh your memory, but at least you haven't lost the thread. So that would be my other bit of advice. But try to do it almost every day, because book writing can be fun if you get into it, and if you're developing an idea over time. You got to stay patient. Books don't get written quickly, but it can be fun if you're sort of keeping at it day after day, at least an hour or two. But it gets very difficult if you write for 6 hours on Saturday or Sunday, and then you wait 4 days because you're teaching, and then you come back on Friday morning and you've got 3 hours blocked off to write, and you sit down and you're like, oh, where was I? It's so painful to write like that, and not recommended. So those are my only bits of advice. And with that, I will sign off.
Thank you so much. It was really nice having you, and I wish to have more interactions with you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Best wishes to
Bye-bye.
all of you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.